Here's a question. Have you ever felt like your Spotify is always way louder on your system than whatever you're working on in your mix? Have you ever been in a vocal recording session and you just can't get the vocals loud enough over the mix without clipping? Or have you ever been in a mix session and you keep clipping your main output no matter what you try? I've got a single solution to all those problems and more. Oh, by the way, I've got a brand new thing I want to share with you here later in the video. Okay, we're going to need some visual aids to help us today. I've got two scenarios I want to throw at you to help demonstrate what we're talking about. 1 and 2. The first involves guitar. Let's say that this is a beautiful electric guitar, and we're plugged into a pedal board that has all kinds of pedals, like a good pedal board does. That looks like a face. The pedal board is going into some sort of amp, and of course the amp has all kinds of knobs on it as well. All right. Yes, I understand the cable would go into this side, but just follow me here. The signal's going like this, and the problem we're facing, let's say we're at a show, and the band says, bro, I can't hear your guitar. Can you make it louder? How do we do that? Well, there are volume knobs here. There are volume knobs on just about every pedal on the board, and of course there are at least 1 or 2 volume knobs on the amp. What's the solution here? Hold that thought for a second. Now, let's say you are running sound for like a big concert, a big festival. Here's the stage that also looks like a face. Hello, I'm a face. Anyway, here's the stage. Here are the speakers. You're back here at front of house, right? You've got all the faders in front of you. You're standing here. This is you. And let's say you're doing rehearsals and you think, man, I'm just not getting enough volume. It's not loud enough. I can hear the stage volume of the drums over the PA. What do you do? How do we get things louder in the room? Now, this seems like a silly analogy, but just stick with me because this makes sense. The answer to both of these questions is, of course, we have to turn something up. But where are we turning it up? The answer is at the end of the chain. So what do I mean? So for the guitar player, yeah, we can turn up the guitar volume knob. That may help a little bit. We can actually crank stuff using like distortion pedals and things like that. But if this amp was set to something like you accidentally bump the volume knob and it's at 1, and it goes all the way from 1 to 11, of course. If it's at 1, no matter how much you crank all of these, you're not going to get much more volume. It makes sense to start at the end of the chain to increase the volume to where we want it to go, and then to adjust the other volumes accordingly. I like to crank my amps and then pull back my guitar volume so I have some always on tap just with the turn of a knob versus being locked in with all of these at full volume and this one too quiet. Same thing at front of house. I'm not a front of house engineer. People ask me about front of house all the time. I don't do that. But if these speakers, let's say these are powered speakers, and the volume on the back of them, again, is at 1 instead of being at 5 or 10, then no matter how much we take our master fader knob and we push it up, and we push up the individual channels and we crank up the preamps, no matter what we do, if this is turned down too far, or the amps feeding this is turned down too far, or it doesn't have enough power on the end of the chain to accommodate the room, then no matter what we do over here at front of house, it's not going to be loud enough. How many faces did I put on here? There's a big face. That looks kind of like a face. I just have faces on the brain. By the way, do you ever work on vocals? If so, I've got a brand new video that's exclusive to my email subscribers. It's called 13 Vocal Production Mistakes. You can access it for free. Just sign up to my email list. Go to homestudiocorner.com/mistakes to get access to it. Somebody told me it's the best video I've ever made, and they've been following me for like 10 years. So it's worth checking out. All right, so what does all this have to do with what I said before? Let's get into it a little bit with a couple of different, I've got 3 scenarios now that I want to look into and show you how the answer to all of these 3 problems is one single solution. Maybe you can guess it already. How does what we talked about here apply to what we do in the studio? Let's talk about it. The first is a vocal recording session. So we're recording vocals. We've got a beautiful microphone plugged into a preamp. That's probably just something on your audio interface. That's going into your software and eventually ends up at a fader. And then that goes through at probably several faders, right? There's like the main fader. There's probably a bus. There's probably a mixed bus fader too. Lots of places where we can mess with the volume. And then that goes out another volume knob, typically on your interface. This is for your speakers, and that goes out and feeds your speakers. I'm going to draw one of them so we don't have as many faces on this drawing as, I mean, that's a cute little face right there. Anyway, so the scenario here, the scenario that I mentioned before, this is going out to the speakers. This is also, let's just assume this is well, there's a separate volume knob that goes out to your headphones. These are headphones, okay? So let's get speakers. Let's remove speakers from this equation for a second and just talk about a volume knob going to headphones. The scenario is, and I actually had this happen in a session that I did with a band. That I went into actually, let me switch to the camera and tell you the story. I was engineering a session with a band, and they had their own rehearsal space, their own setup, their own headphone system, where each member of the band had a mixer where they could set their own headphone mix. Pretty clever. Problem was, I looked at every one of their mixers, and the metering on there was completely in the red. Every channel on every mixer was completely clipping. When I put their headphones on, it was just like everything we recorded. All the tracks we had, drums, bass, percussion, guitars, horn sections, lots of keyboards, everything was clipping. And so they're saying, Joe, you're a terrible engineer. Everything sounds like garbage in my head. They didn't say that, but I bet they were thinking it. What was the problem? The problem was they turned everything up but their headphones. Back to the picture. To use our scenario here, first, typical people would turn the preamp up as loud as it'll go without clipping. That's their first solution. Then they push this fader up, and they push any other faders they have to get it as loud as they want. And when it's not loud enough, they just keep pushing up all of these faders. They keep going, turn it up more, turn it up more. Eventually the preamp clips. Eventually these go as loud as they'll go, and they're still not getting it loud enough. I know this seems super elementary, but the answer to all of their problems is this single volume knob on the headphones. Why? Because that's at the end of the chain. Remember, the problem is at the end of the chain if we're talking about volume. What you do, this is the answer. This is the thing I'm trying to tell you in this video, is you turn your either headphones or your speakers, you turn them up to solve so many of these problems. So you may think, if I turn that up, I'm going to blow my ears out. Yeah, you are. So you're going to have to turn all these down so that you can turn this one up. And crank this one up, set the level, the preamp level, at a nice conservative level. If this is your meter, and if this is clipping, and this is all the way down, have your meter go to somewhere like that. You might think there's no way that'd be loud enough. Listen, turn your headphones up. Turn up the headphones. Then you set your faders all at 0, or maybe you push the faders up a little bit, but this you crank up until your actual mouth, this is someone singing. That's not a terrible face. Until you hear yourself in the headphones at a nice loud volume. Then adjust everything else to match that. If the music is way louder than your voice is already loud enough, so just turn the different music faders down to match your voice. You can't do any of that until you turn up the headphones. Make sense? All right, second scenario is a mix. You got all these tracks you're mixing, and your main master fader here, which has its own meter, is you're mixing, you're having fun. These are all faders here. You're pushing faders, you're adding EQs and compressors, you're having just a wonderful time. And the problem is, you look at your mix bus, and this mix clip light is going off all the time. Instead of the meters being like down in here, your meters are going all the way up all the time. So you literally play this game where you say, oh, it's clipping. So then you come and you turn something down. And then you're like, great, we're not clipping. Then you mix, up, it's clipping. You turn something else down. Then you think, great, shoot. And then you keep playing that game. You keep turning everything down just a smidge. And eventually this starts to clip. Why does this happen? Because what you want to hear in your ears is a nice, loud, punchy mix. This fader is feeding a volume knob that is feeding your speakers. Look at that beautiful speaker. So if you keep pushing these faders up because you want to hear it nice and loud, but it keeps clipping here. So you turn it back down, and then it doesn't feel very good. So you start the way you mix, whether it's with your plugins or with your faders, you're pushing these things up to get it nice and loud and rocking, and then you see that you're clipping, so you have to pull them back down. Or maybe you push this up. That doesn't help. That still clips. The solution, what's the solution? Say it together. Turn up the volume. Turn your speakers up. I'm not saying it needs to be playing at a super loud volume. I'm saying turn this up to where all of these faders can now be turned down and reasonable to where this level, instead of clipping all the time, is maybe more like coming up to like here at max on the meter. And then you've got a nice loud volume coming out of your speakers. If you have this down, all of this can be turned up and it's still not loud enough, and you have clipping, and it makes you have this face right here. Nobody wants to have that face. Third scenario, Spotify or Apple Music or whatever you use to listen. You're listening to your favorite music, and it almost feels like this. The music you're listening to, maybe as a reference, is like this loud when you play it on your speakers, and then your mix coming out of your master fader is only like this loud. So you're trying to be a good boy or girl. You're trying to compare between the two, but you can't because this one is so much quieter than that. So what's the solution? Dun, dun, dun. Both of these, by the way, are feeding a volume knob that is feeding speakers. The solution here, again, is to turn the speakers up. But what does that do? This one's kind of a two-step solution. You turn the speakers up until this is at a nice volume. So it's the same solution we had over here. Same solution. You turn this up until your mix is at a nice volume, and then inevitably the mastering, the Spotify is going to be a mastered level. It's going to be very, very loud because that's what mastered music sounds like. So inside of your Spotify, you turn it down so that this matches this. When you do that, you've got this turned up so where this will still feel nice and loud, this will feel the same volume, and now you can actually do some comparisons between the two to see if you're on track for your mix. Now, I don't do a lot of specifically referencing like this, but I do listen to a lot of Spotify, Apple Music, YouTube, and they're all mastered and very loud. And I'm listening on the same system where I work on recordings and mixes. So I've got it set up such that all of these get turned down before they hit my speaker, so that my mixes at full volume sound great, and then anything that's mastered, meaning anything on the internet, basically, that's super ridiculously loud, that's all being turned down, so it's hitting my volume in my speakers and my ears at the same volume. All right, here's a bonus tip. There are 3 different volumes that I use in my studio. I have my volume set, my volume knob, let's say. I actually use a fader for this, but let's just say it's a volume knob. There are 3 positions that I use on my volume knob. There are 3 things that I do in the studio. I'm either listening to something that's mastered, I'm listening to something that's mixed, or I'm recording something. And these 3 require different volumes. So when I'm working on mastering or listening to something that's mastered, i.e. everything on the internet, I have my volume pretty far down because this is already very loud. When I'm working on a mix, I have my volume maybe right here, because mixes are quieter than mastered stuff. So when I'm working on anything that's basically not mastered, I have the volume set here because I need more speaker volume to hear this at the same level as this. So if I switch back and forth, I either have to turn this volume back and forth, or I have to adjust this volume down another way, which is what I just talked about. And then the third scenario, if I'm working on recording, if I've got a vocal and I've turned it on and I've got the preamp set to something like this, so it's only coming up about halfway, if that's not loud enough, I've got to turn up the volume even more. So when I record, typically I typically put my mix on a VCA, all the instruments, the band, turn those down so that I can turn my vocal up, and then I make sure that this is nice and loud too. So this makes the mix still feel pretty loud. The vocal feels nice and loud, but this is way too loud of a volume for mixing, but it's perfect for recording because I kind of turn everything down so I can hear my voice on top of everything else. So these are the 3 volumes that I use. Whatever your volume knob is, just have 3. They can be arbitrary positions. I always master at this position. I always mix at this position. And when I'm recording, I typically have it at that position. And this one I go to rarely. These are the 2 that I go to the most because sometimes I don't need that extra volume, but sometimes I do. This is the way that I think about it. I start here and then I adjust everything up the chain to match this. All right, I hope that made sense for you. If you liked this and you haven't checked out that 13 vocal production mistakes video yet, I'll remind you again, just go to homestudiocorner.com/mistakes to check it out for free. Thanks for watching. See ya.